As the 26th APEC leaders meeting wraps up and U.S. President Donald Trump prepares to meet Chinese President Xi Jinping later this month, what chances are there to avert a full-scale trade war between the world's largest economies? And we'll also be hearing how a new directive from China's State Council is likely to have far-reaching effects on the country's kindergartens. Welcome to The Point. Live from Beijing, I'm Li Xin. The 26th Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Economic Leaders Meeting fizzled to a close in Port Moresby, Papua New Guinea, with no joint statement signed for the first time in its history since the body was established in 1989. Chinese President Xi Jinping on Saturday delivered a speech in which he highlighted the need for global cooperation and an open global economy. He told world leaders there was no issue that countries couldn't work out through consultation, and history has shown that confrontation, whether in the form of a cold war, a hot war or a trade war, will produce no winners. So what's new between these familiar sounding lines? And meanwhile, U.S. President Donald Trump has expressed optimism about resolving the U.S.-China trade disputes before meeting President Xi in Argentina later this month. How likely are the world's largest economies able to hammer out a framework agreement to ease the ongoing trade tension? Joining me from Washington, D.C. is Dennis Wilder, an assistant professor at Georgetown University, and here in Beijing, Zhao Hai, a research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. So, as I said at the beginning of the show, for the very first time, no joint statement was signed by world leaders at the APEC Economic Leaders Meeting. Some U.S. media have said that this does not only reflect the difference between China and the U.S., but also difference between China and all the other APEC members. Professor Wilder, do we know exactly what happened? What have you heard?
Well, we really don't know. Obviously, both the United States and China have a view on what happened. From what I'm hearing in Washington, there were some objections on the Chinese side to the use of a term in the document that said that there were some unfair trading practices in the world that needed to be corrected. And apparently the Chinese felt that was an pointed American attempt to include the trade agenda into the document. I'm not sure what happened. I'm sure we'll hear different versions of the story over the coming days. I think the important thing to understand is that this reflects a very serious moment in the U.S.-China relationship, where we are going through a fundamental reassessment of our relations. And as President Xi said, we are at a crossroads. And I think that is the most important thing to understand, that we are at an incredibly important moment.
Yeah. Well, Zhao Hai, is that what you heard as well about the wording in the draft document? And if China would really have something to say about, or some kind of a disagreement with the wording with the document, does China have the right to say, we don't want this to be in the final document?
Well, the details is not very clear at this point, but from what we heard, it is actually the U.S. side has trying to put into certain sentences referring to the reform of the WTO, which has no consensus at this moment, and also has trying to put into a sentence about the state-owned enterprises. So at the end of the day, it's very clear that it is the United States side blocked the consensus of the APEC summit joint statement from coming out, not the Chinese side, different from the other 20 countries. But besides that, if you consider the history of past 25 years, the reason that in the past 25 years we have joint statements year after year is because there's consensus of global trade, of globalization, of liberalization of trade, and also of the common goal of achieving more prosperity and achieving the same goal in the Asia-Pacific region. However, at this point, China didn't change its course, China continued to push for more integration and economic freedom. But I think it's the U.S. side that has changed towards more protectionism and trying to force on China certain terms and concessions. So I think that's the difference that caused the no joint statement from this summit.
Okay, it was also reported by some Western media that Chinese officials barged into the office of the Papua New Guinea foreign minister's office, and that police were even called in, and saying that the Chinese were trying to, in the 11th hour bid, to influence the final draft communique, but were denied entry. Okay, I don't know what happened, but the word barged, sound very dramatic. Professor Wilder, you were also a diplomat once, I believe, or you were with a U.S. government delegation numerous times. Is it really thinkable for any government official trying to barge into the office of a foreign minister of another country and try to, make him sign up to something that, we don't like it, take this out?
Well, I think that what this shows is that the APEC nations, and particularly the APEC host, was put in a very awkward position. The APEC host was trying to get an agreement, couldn't get an agreement, and I think the APEC host said something about what was I to do? I was in the middle of two great powers. It reminds me of the story of, when the two elephants fight, the ants get trampled. And I think in this case, we see a situation in which, indeed, the host was put in a very awkward position, whether or not there was a barging into the office.
Mr. Zhao, what is your take on the situation and your reaction to Professor Wilder's interpretation?
I agree with Professor Wilder's interpretation. On the other hand, I think the Ministry of Foreign Affairs spokesperson representing China has already said that this is unthinkable. It's not happening, and it's fake news. I choose to believe the spokesperson from China's Minister of Foreign Affairs. I don't think this ever happened as described by foreign media. The thing is, there's a process in place. If China disagrees with the joint statement, China will go through the process and trying to change that and reach a new consensus. I think what happened is that in that moment, China is trying to find the foreign minister or the president, trying to change the text and raise concerns about certain sentences. And during that process, because the certain probably disoriented or not clear process, there's some confusion and some disagreement. I don't think exactly what happened is that China is trying to barge into a certain office and try to forcefully change
But on the other hand, right, the APEC has always worked on a consensus basis, meaning if everybody are on board, then you can say this is our joint statement. But if one member country says, this is some kind of term that we do not agree with, then does the host country have the right to say, but this is the majority's will, and we're going to have it out whether you like it or not, Professor Wilder?
Well, I think that's exactly why there wasn't a statement, because it was clear that neither the United States nor China were comfortable with the draft as it was proposed. And so, yes, we have had a situation here where the APEC statement could not be agreed to, and APEC is a consensus organization, and therefore there wasn't a communique.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's entirely appropriate that if they weren't able to reach an agreement, you don't have a communique.
Okay. Yeah, earlier, Zhao Hai, you mentioned the WTO. Talking about the WTO, President Xi really had something to say. Let's listen to what he said about the WTO reform.
We should say no to protectionism and unilateralism, uphold the WTO-centered multilateral trading system, make economic globalization more open, inclusive, balanced, and beneficial to all, and expand converging interest and shared opportunities through opening up and cooperation.
Well, that has always been China's position here. But what is the point of diversion between China and the United States on the future of WTO, Mr. Zhao?
Well, I think it's very clear that China supports the multilateralism and multilateral system that current free trade system based upon. And WTO is at the center of this whole web of system. And if you wanted to upgrade and reform the WTO, it should also be based upon consensus and continuous negotiation between China and other parties concerned, particularly between China and the United States. And if the U.S. wanted to change that and particularly harm the center mechanism called dispute settlement mechanism at the center of the WTO without consensus, it's bound to weaken and even dissolve this WTO system. So from China's perspective, we wanted to uphold the system and try to improve it instead of tear it down.
And also China does not want to rush to any reform without careful consideration and elaboration. I understand that. Okay, I really have this question about the upcoming meeting that is really important. So I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to Professor Wilder, because President Xi pointed out that China would like to address differences with APEC countries through consultation and explore solutions to common challenges in the spirit of partnership. He also said unilateralism and protectionism will not solve problems but add uncertainty to the world economy, and history has shown that confrontation, whether in the form of a cold war, hot war or a trade war, produces no winners. Do you see that as some kind of a message potentially targeted to the United States, or is he trying to set the tone for the upcoming meeting between him and President Trump in Argentina?
I think definitely he's sending a message to Washington. I did see in his statement that he said he wanted a constructive meeting and that he's looking for ways in which the United States and China can move forward. He also made some very strong commitments, continued commitments to opening up the Chinese economy, reducing trade protectionism, these kinds of things that the United States is looking for. I want to make a quick point here. The United States is not a protectionist nation. When we talk about the free and open Indo-Pacific, we are talking about free trade. We are talking about changes to the WTO that have long been needed. China joined the WTO 18 years ago. It's time for some updating. The world economy has changed dramatically. China's economy has changed dramatically in those years. The United States is not looking for protectionism. We're looking for free and fair trade.
Okay, the word free is not so much on the lips of President Trump at this moment for a while now, but I take your word for the moment. And let's listen to what Vice President of the United States, Mike Pence, said actually almost immediately after the Chinese president. He said that while they had great respect for President Xi and China, there will be no backing down on the trade war with Beijing until it changes its ways. And actually 2 days ago, U.S. President Donald Trump said that he's hopeful the U.S. and China will make a deal in Argentina, meaning, and that if we don't, we are doing very well just the way it is right now. So, Zhao Hai, how do you read his tone? Is he out of step with his president, who already expressed optimism about the upcoming meeting in Argentina?
Well, I think so. I think at this moment, President Trump is trying to reach a deal with President Xi. Both presidents have made phone calls, and they have set the date during G20 to have a meeting. And at this moment, really both sides want to reach a deal to relieve the tension and to reduce the possibility of going into a whole-scale trade war. However, I think, on the other hand, Vice President Pence is playing this good cop, bad cop role, and also he's traveling with John Bolton, the National Security Advisor, and they both emphasize on the more confrontational front of U.S.-China side of the U.S.-China relations. So I think the difference between the tones you may interpret differently, but I think at this moment is not helpful.
Yeah, well, 10 days to go. You never know what's going to happen in those 10 days. We have to leave it here, though. Dennis Wilder, Assistant Professor at Georgetown University, and Zhao Hai, a Research Fellow with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. You have been watching The Point with me, Liu Xin. We'll take a short break, and when I come back, I'll be finding out how a new ruling or new directive by China's State Council is likely to have far-reaching effects on the country's children. Stay with me. China's State Council has said it is to tighten investment in preschool education following a public outcry over several cases of children abuse in private kindergartens. The new policy bans private kindergarten operators from obtaining funding through a public listing, meaning that listed companies are forbidden from investing in private kindergartens through share sales or cash injections under the new policy. Private investors will also be barred from backing public kindergartens. The restrictions are said to be part of a broader preschool education reform which sets goals to provide more affordable preschools and increase public funding. According to the new policy, by 2020, 85% of children aged between 3 and 6 should be enrolled in licensed kindergartens. So how is this likely to affect China's preschool education market, and how can the booming demand be met for Chinese parents wanting safe, affordable and quality education for their kids? Joining me are Xie Yi, founder of the wasnt Institute of Multicultural Education here in Beijing, and Gerald Anthony, a school counselor working for the Beijing office of the Special Education Network in Asia, a professional association that advocates and provides support to children of different abilities. Welcome to both of you. It's a very interesting subject and very much in the news, I believe. But first of all, to our international audience who probably have very little context to the whole story, what is this policy really about? What does it try to tackle?
I think this policy is the very hard one ever in the history to really define the nature of preschool education in China, which is non-for-profit, which is for the children, by the family, and also of the people.
Okay, that's very interesting. So does that mean that before this policy came out, the great majority of kindergartens here in China are private, or?
It's very diversified, or in a very wild and diversified market, because preschool education is not included into compulsory education for a long time. So it's mainly by this like a civil movement or civil strength, the educators and capitalists in the civil society who just share these burdens and responsibilities in the past years.
Okay, do we have a rough idea? Anthony, Gerard, if you want to join us, you're more than welcome to provide additional information. I mean, do we have a kind of a percent mix, like how big is the share of a private kindergarten versus public kindergarten? Do we have any idea here, Gerard?
Well, with private kindergartens in the recent few years, they have been growing exponentially, and a lot of that is based upon the mandate that English must be taught as a compulsory requirement of education. And
in
so,
those preschools?
Starting from preschool. It needs to be part of the elementary education.
Okay.
Previously it was not, and so what you're seeing is a balance of the private sector injecting into the public sector, to where it was majority public before, but now it's becoming more private-based because of the English language teaching, which is inviting more foreign teachers into the industry.
In terms of the charge, the fees, how does it compare with the private sector? For instance, the private kindergarten would be minimal charges, right, levied on the parents. What about the private kindergarten?
In China?
Yeah.
I think it varies based on where is the kindergarten. Usually, if in the countryside, it's pretty cheap and affordable, several hundred yuan.
The private ones?
Yes.
Okay, so that would be less than $100 a month?
Yes.
But
for the countryside of China, but in this like first-line cities or even in the second or third layers, private educators or private kindergartens are usually marked with expensiveness, or they are very pricey.
That could be like what, $1,000 a month or something like that?
Almost.
Yes. Yeah, easily. And if they're marketed as a premium kindergarten, which a lot of schools like to market themselves, the price point is actually something that helps recruit the students.
Because people believe in higher price means higher quality.
It's like insurance. If you charge me high, that means you just must provide something good for my children.
Okay, there must be a reason why this is so expensive. So when this directive comes out, what's going to happen to the public kindergarten, to the ones that are reasonably priced by private, by the society, let's say, and the super expensive ones?
Right. I think this new policy will definitely drive into two extreme situations. On one side, there will be a small number of private kindergartens have to stand through the examination of the market and be really expensive, really good, really stylish in a way to satisfy a certain class of the society. But the majority of the kindergartens will be public owned and also under the supervision of the government.
But what happens to these kindergartens that have always been private? I mean, is the government going to take over? Are they going to be closed down? What is going to happen, Gerald?
I believe that the government is going to look for ways to push people into the public sector, but there's always going to be those upper class citizens that are going to look for private kindergartens because they believe that's what can help their child go abroad for universities, which is the end product.
Right.
And I think a lot of parents plan for that end product.
Well, people will have the choice, right? But but when you have a lot of the middle-range priced kindergartens closed down, where will the parents send their children to?
That's actually really like an English saying that you throw this baby with the bath towel. So this majority of the kindergarten market during the past years are those non-licensed, middle income families send their children to. So with this like a very quick policy issuing, a lot of schools were shut, and thousands or even more than that number of children are schoolless in a sense.
Yeah. Well, did the government have some kind of plan or some kind of future plan, let's say, to take care of this part of the market so that, you know, eventually they will have the public kindergarten that the government want them to go to?
Definitely. I think this new policy is pretty complete. On one side, it has a very strong push to really move this preschool education into the public channel. On the other side, that it admit the value of preschool teachers' social status and to improve their educational situations and to make sure the national finance will support this sector more than ever before.
So does that also mean that by barring private funding going into the private kindergartens, the government will have to pay much more to build many more kindergartens, right, Gerald?
Obviously, with anything in the public sector, the funding is going to come from public money, usually in the form of taxes. But what you have to realize in China in particular, you have a small percentage that are usually on the eastern coast of the cities that are quite wealthy. But a majority of the Chinese are in the countryside to where they are not anywhere close to that level of income. And so their tax money is going to be minimal compared to those of the wealthier families. But most wealthier families, again, look at that premium price and they say, I want my child to go to a kindergarten that prepares them to go abroad for education, or to the Peking universities, the Renmin universities, the better universities in China. And so I see that the private kindergartens as a starting point will still exist even with this policy, because there's always going to be small capital people looking to start their own schools.
Well, but with the Chinese middle class boom expanding, I would imagine that there will be more people with the money looking for quality education. So will the public kindergartens be able to provide that kind of quality education for preschool children for these middle income classes and in such large quantity?
That's a very good question, because quality of this preschool education is really a challenge for the past years. It is not included in the compulsory, so the investment of the government and the non-government levels are not so noticed in this field. So when I was a professor at Peking University, I noticed that there's 18-year-old, 19-year-old girls who graduated from very mini-level schools, just graduated to teach kindergarten kids from middle-level families. So the teacher's certificate educational background is not strong enough to really teach children from a wealthy family. So this is really a weird situation.
But with the new set of policy, do you see that situation likely to change? Because that is also, I believe, one of the factors that had led to child abuse cases in kindergartens in China, is precisely because of the lack of qualification of these teachers.
I think it will definitely change, but it needs time. It will not happen in the 1 or 2 years, because the development of teacher is a long process.
Right.
I would also add that in education, you specifically need to look at 3 factors: the inputs, kind of the transformation, and the outputs. I see with the government and this policy, the focus is more on the outputs, shifting the output of the students into the public sector away from the private sector. But in education, something that's going to be important are the inputs and the transformation that takes place in the schools.
Okay.
I think that's something to where the government might have some challenges holding accountability there. The private industry, because they're self-governed, can have a higher stake of accountability. And so I think the inputs in the transformation process would be a little stronger there.
Yeah, I think a lot of scrutiny will be placed on the governments at various levels, whether they can take up that chunk of providing service for these children. Another question or another challenge came from some other people who said, why not leaving it to the market to decide? You know, if there are people who want to invest, if there is a huge market. I mean, the number for last year was 713 billion, this preschool education market. Why not just opening it up?
Well, this is really an old game, like capital and education. We just discussed before coming to the table. We heard culture and industry, but we rarely hear the education industry. So there is a part of education can never ever be commercialized and marketized. Yeah, that's the nature of education. However, if we want to really, one, improve the whole quality of the education, second, to satisfy the diversification of the society, we need money. We need financial input.
Right. Well, for the children with special abilities, Gerard, is this going to affect your work?
Yeah, actually in the preschool and the kindergarten, actually something that we look at is how the child is developing and are they reaching those milestones. Typically when they don't reach those milestones, that's a small indicator that there might be special needs that are occurring. And so if we have more and more children going into the public sector, we may not have those specialists that can identify children who are not meeting those milestones. So yeah, that actually would affect a lot of what we do here in Beijing.
Okay, indeed, a very big task ahead for the Chinese government. 10 seconds if you can.
10 seconds. Actually, private education is not only marked by money, but also by the tailor-made, by the personalization of this education. So this standardization of the preschool really have a big influence on the diversification of thoughts and needs.
Definitely, this is a very important age. In Chinese, we say 3岁看到老. You can tell how this person will be later in his or her life from the age of 3, right? When someone is 3, you know, okay, this is
a long talk.
Yes. So anyway, we have to leave it there. Xie Yi, founder of the Eastwind Institute of Multicultural Education, and Gerald Anthony, a school counselor for the Beijing office of the Special Education Network in Asia. And with that, we are going to wrap up this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch the show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.